urban archaeologists. We've journeyed from Fritz Lang's dystopian machine city to the immigrant tenements of Lower East Side. This week, we're trading survival anxieties for survival parties as we explore how the 1920s transformed American cities into playgrounds of reinvention, rebellion, and really questionable life choices. Now I know what you're thinking. Some Like It Hot was made in 1959 and is set in 1929, so we're looking at the 1920s through a 1950s lens. Excellent observation. This temporal layering actually makes our film more interesting. It's both a documentary of how the 1950s remembered the 1920s and a surprisingly accurate depiction of how cities functioned as spaces of transformation during the Jazz Age. If the immigrant neighborhoods we studied last week were about preserving identity while adapting to urban life, the 1920s city was about discarding identity entirely and trying on new ones like party dresses. The urban environment had evolved from a place where you might accidentally become someone new to a place where you could deliberately, systematically, and repeatedly reinvent yourself. Look at our protagonists, Joe and Jerry. Chicago offers them the chance to become completely different people. Not just new names or new jobs, but new genders. The city provides the infrastructure for this transformation, the anonymity, the mobility, the spaces where no one asks too many questions about your past. This wasn't just Hollywood fantasy. The 1920s city really was a place where social boundaries were more fluid than they'd ever been before. Jazz clubs where black and white musicians played together, speakeasies where working class and upper class drinkers rubbed elbows, and dance halls where traditional gender roles got sweaty and complicated. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the illegal bar in the basement. Prohibition didn't stop drinking. It just made drinking urban. Rural areas could still get alcohol, but cities became the epicenters of organized illegal activity. Every major American city essentially became a criminal enterprise, with mayors, police chiefs, and respectable citizens all participating in a massive conspiracy to ignore federal law. Some Like It Hot captures this beautifully. The speakeasy isn't just a bar. It's a symbol of urban rebellion against rural moral authority. Cities had always been suspect to rural America, but prohibition made urban areas explicitly illegitimate in the eyes of federal law. The response? Cities doubled down on being cities. The result was an urban culture built around collective lawbreaking. When everyone's a criminal, criminality loses its stigma. This created an urban environment where other social rules could be questioned too. If we're going to ignore the Constitution about alcohol, why not ignore social conventions about race, gender, and class? Here's something fascinating. The 1920s were the first decade when urban entertainment became a major economic sector. Cities had always had theaters and saloons, but 1920s saw the rise of a full-scale urban leisure economy. Nightclubs, dance halls, movie palaces, sports stadiums, and amusement parks. This wasn't just about having fun. It was about cities marketing themselves as places where you could go to buy experiences that were unavailable anywhere else. Rural America might have natural beauty and moral certainty, but cities had jazz, cocktails, and the chance to dance until dawn with strangers. The film shows us how this economy worked. Sweet Sue's band traveled from city to city, providing entertainment for people who work all day in urban industries and want to forget about it all night in urban playgrounds. The city becomes a 24-hour organism, with different populations using the same spaces for different purposes around the clock. One of the most important urban innovations of the 1920s was the perfection of anonymity as a social technology. In small towns, everyone knows everyone's business. In immigrant neighborhoods, community surveillance can be just as intense. But the 1920s city developed spaces where you could be completely anonymous. Joe and Jerry's transformation works because cities had become places where you could encounter hundreds of people every day. No one has time to investigate everyone's background. The urban night could become a kind of social camouflage. This anonymity was particularly liberating for groups that faced restrictions in other contexts. Cities became places where women could behave in ways that would be scandalous in their hometowns, where racial boundaries could be temporarily blurred, and where sexual and gender norms could be experimented with. The flip side? This same anonymity made cities feel dangerous and morally uncertain to people who preferred certainty and well-defined social roles. Let's talk about sugarcane, because Marilyn Monroe's character represents a specifically urban type of woman that emerged in the 1920s. Economically independent, sexually autonomous, geographically mobile, and utterly uninterested in traditional domestic roles. Sugar travels with an all-female band. supports herself through her own talents, drinks illegally, and makes her own romantic choices. This character type was possible only in cities, when women could find work that didn't depend on family connections, housing that didn't require male supervision, and social environments that didn't enforce traditional gender roles. But notice how the film also shows the vulnerabilities of the urban independence. Sugar is constantly broke, romantically disappointed, and professionally insecure. The city offers women freedom, but not security. This tension between liberation and vulnerability becomes a central theme of the urban woman's experience. The 1920s city promised women that they could have careers, romance, adventure, and independence. It didn't promise that any of these would be easy or sustainable. The music in Some Like It Hot isn't just soundtrack, it's sociology. Jazz emerged from urban environments where different musical traditions collided and merged. It's music that could only have been created in cities by musicians who had access to multiple cultural influences and audiences who were willing to hear something completely new. Jazz also represents something revolutionary about 1920s urban culture. It was improvisational. Traditional music follows established rules and structures. Jazz makes up new rules as it goes along. This perfectly captured the spirit of 1920s urban life, where people were improvising new ways to be modern, new ways to be themselves. The film shows us integrated bands and audiences, something that was happening in real 1920s cities, despite segregation laws. Music became one of the few spaces where urban racial boundaries could be temporarily transcended. The 1920s were the decade when Americans became truly mobile. Cars, trains, buses, and airplanes made it possible to move between cities quickly and frequently. For the first time, you could live in one city, work in another, and party in a third. Our protagonists embody this new mobility. They flee Chicago for Florida not because they have family connections or job opportunities, but simply because they need to be somewhere else quickly. The city becomes part of a network of urban destinations, each offering different possibilities for reinvention. The mobility had profound social implications. If you could leave your hometown and start over in a new city, traditional social hierarchies became less meaningful. Family background, local reputation, even criminal history could be left behind. The city becomes a kind of witness protection program for anyone who wants to escape their past. Notice how much of the action takes place in hotels. The hotel represents a specifically urban form of living, temporary, anonymous, service-oriented, and available to anyone who can pay. Hotels embody urban values. They're egalitarian, diverse, and focused on present pleasure rather than future stability. The hotel also represents urban loneliness. It's a place where you can be surrounded by people but know none of them, where you can have all the surfaces of a home but none of the emotional connections. Sugar's hotel room becomes a space of both independence and isolation. Let's address the gangsters, because they represent something important about 1920s urban development. Organized crime wasn't just about breaking laws. It was about creating alternative urban institutions. Gangsters provided services like alcohol, gambling, and protection that legal institutions couldn't or wouldn't provide. The film shows us how organized crime created its own urban geography. Speakeasies, gambling dens, and criminal hideouts became parallel urban infrastructure. Cities essentially had two governments, the official one that followed federal law and the unofficial one that followed local demand. This created urban environments where authority was constantly contested and negotiated. Who's really in charge? The mayor or the mob boss? The police or the bootleggers? This ambiguity made cities exciting but also unstable. The elaborate costume changes in Some Like It Hot aren't just comedy. They're commentary on how fashion became a form of urban communication in the 1920s. Clothes became a way to signal which version of yourself you were presenting on any given day. Cities developed complex fashion codes that allowed people to communicate their intentions, availability, social status, and even moral positions through their clothing choices. The right dress could get you into the right speakeasy. The wrong outfit would mark you as a tourist or a moral reformer. The fashion fluidity was particularly important for women who used clothing to signal their relationship to traditional gender roles. A flapper dress wasn't just a fashion choice. It was a political statement about female autonomy and sexual liberation. One of the most significant urban innovations of the 1920s was the development of a thriving night economy. Cities have always had some nighttime activity, but the 1920s saw the creation of entire districts devoted to after-dark entertainment. The film captures this night economy brilliantly. During the day, cities are about work, efficiency, and productivity, At night, they become about pleasure, excess, and escape. The same spaces are used differently and entirely different social rules apply. This night economy created jobs. Musicians, dancers, bartenders, doormen that existed nowhere but in cities. It also created a temporal form of urban citizenship, people who belonged to the night city but were strangers to the day city. Here's what makes Some Like It Hot sociologically sophisticated. It's set in 1929, just months before the stock market crash that would end the Jazz Age party. The film's madcap energy comes. Here's what makes Some Like It Hot sociologically sophisticated. It's set in 1929, just months before the stock market crash that would end the Jazz Age party. The film's madcap energy carries an undertone of impending disaster. All this urban experimentation, this geographic and social mobility, this collective law-breaking and identity fluidity is unsustainable. The character's frantic energy reflects the broader urban energy of the late 1920s, everyone dancing faster and faster, partly because they're having fun, partly because they sense that the music's about to stop. The film suggests that the urban freedoms of the 1920s came with costs that couldn't be calculated until later. The mobility that allowed geographic escape also created rootlessness. The anonymity that enabled reinvention also enabled exploitation. The rebellion against traditional authority created a vacuum that organized crime filled. Some Like It Hot shows us that cities in the 1920s became laboratories for testing the limits of social flexibility. How much change can human communities absorb? How much individual freedom is compatible with social stability? And how do you create urban institutions that are both exciting and sustainable? The film suggests that the 1920s city succeeded brilliantly as a space of liberation and failed spectacularly as a space of security. It offered unprecedented opportunities for personal reinvention, but couldn't guarantee that the new selves people created would be better than the old ones they abandoned. As we move forward in our course, we'll see how the urban experimentation of the 1920s set up the urban crisis of the 1930s. The mobility that seemed liberating in good times became desperate displacement during the Depression. The anonymity that enabled fun also enabled exploitation. And the weakening of traditional authority that allowed for creativity also allowed for corruption. Next week, we'll explore how cities dealt with economic collapse and how the urban freedoms of the 1920s looked very different when people couldn't afford to exercise them. As you think about this week's materials, consider these questions. What happens when cities become successful at enabling individuals' reinvention? Can urban communities survive if everyone is constantly becoming someone else? And what are the hidden costs of urban freedom? Also think about how the 1950s perspective of Some Like It Hot might romanticize or distort the actual experience of 1920s urban life. What does it mean to look back nostalgically at a decade that ended in economic disaster? The party's about to end, folks. Next week, we'll see what happens when the urban playground becomes an urban battleground for survival. From gin and jazz to bread lines and desperation, the city gets real, fast.